Thank you for coming to be with us tonight. We have a very rich event. We're doing two things. The first part is arguably the difficult part. We're looking at North Africa 6 years after the events that became known as the Arab Spring. 6 very difficult years, challenging years, a lot of hope, a lot of disappointment, the highs and the lows, and we're not done yet, and we don't know where we're actually heading. That's the difficult part of the conversation, for which we've assembled 3 excellent commentators, analysts, speakers, whom I will introduce in just a moment. The second part of the event is the more pleasant one. We're celebrating the completion and publication of a book by one of our visiting fellows at Brookings, which focuses especially on Egypt. That part, I think, is more of a celebration on our part, but it also feeds into the discussion, clarifies a lot of the issues, and raises some important questions about the future. Our 3 guest panelists today are very dear friends of mine and friends of you. You've seen them at other events in Doha. You've followed them on TV. You probably have read their articles. They bring a great deal to bear on the issues we're discussing. Immediately to my left is our dear friend, Dr. Arbi Siddiqui, who's a noted expert on democratization, political and economic reform in the Arab world, especially with the focus on North Africa. He's a professor of politics at Qatar University and has served previously at a number of other universities around the world, including at the University of Exeter, where he taught international relations and published a few books on democratization. To his left is a dear friend by the name of Samer Shahata, who's currently a professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies and concurrently a professor of international relations and comparative politics at the University of Oklahoma. He has taught at more universities than I can go through the list right now, including at Georgetown, where we overlapped in Washington for many, many years. He's an expert on Islam and politics, on the Brotherhood specifically, an expert on Egypt, and has written extensively on the subject. To his left is our dear friend Adil Abdel Ghaffar, the visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center. He's a member of our family. He's acting as a director of research at the moment, and he's the person who's published the book, the subject of which was partly supervised, aided by the 2 gentlemen to my left, and which has recently just been published. The title of the book is Egyptians in Revolt, the Political Economy of Labor and Student Mobilizations from 1919 to 2011. The book fills a very important vacuum in our literature on the history of revolts in the region, and specifically on the role of student movements. More on this, inshallah, as we get into the discussion. But I thought maybe the first thing we would do initially to get us all going and to ease us into this very challenging but very interesting discussion would be to start off with each of our 3 speakers from their respective vantage points, from their areas of expertise. What can they tell us about what we have witnessed in the last 6 years of revolt, revolution, transition, achievements, and setbacks, and a lot of uncertainty about the future following the Arab Spring. Dr. Larbi, we'll start with you.
Thanks so much indeed. I'm so honored to be here and to share this platform with my colleagues Samir, Tariq, and Adil. I think really for me, there's like this huge challenge to interpret and understand and reread a phenomenon which has begun in a very amorphous way. And that really has remained for me the biggest challenge, something that begins amorphously. It's leaderless. It has displayed types of activism, fearless activism, and how to basically engineer the kind of skills that lend themselves to the creation of the values that lend themselves to democracy and democratization. And I think really that has not changed at all. I know people always talk of Tunisia as some kind of exceptionalism. And I think even within this case, you'll find that depending on the metrics of democratization that you utilize, you'll find that there are lots of gaps, even in the Tunisian case. Because I guess really if we depart from an understanding of democracy and democratization in a minimalist way, and that is the representation of difference, that remains the biggest challenge, of the Arab Spring, how to represent difference, any type of difference, moral, religious, ideological, political, social, and really to my mind, what I see, I always see the margins. And this is really the biggest thing about the Arab Spring. It has alerted us to the gaps in academia, in the intellectual undertaking of how to understand, I guess, really North Africa, the Arab region, because we have this obsession with the state. So for 40, 50 years, we've focused on the state, and suddenly we've got like this explosion of activism that no one has ever expected or even hinted at in any work that we are familiar with. And that is exactly really what, so now really what we have this redirection, so really from the state to society. So it's basically the profusion of forces, discourses, struggles below the state that in a way animate our imagination about how to rethink the Arab Spring. For me, I think it remains a rehearsal of things to come in the future. I'm not convinced that this is the end, as some people really have rushed to killing the Arab Spring. It's almost like, it's dead, declared either winter or declared a failed ferment. And for me, really, this is basically the beginning. It's the acquisition of the ethos of revolution that probably will be on display for a long time to come, simply because the dynamics and the triggers of the Arab Spring that we've seen in places like Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and elsewhere are still there. I know I go back to my homeland, Tunisia, and I go to the south, and really what I see marginalization. I know in the public discourse and the formal parlance of democracy and democratization, Tunisia, as I said earlier, is taken to be a leader, the trailblazer in this whole process. But really when you submerge, when you go deep down, you plunge below the surface, what you see really the kind of problems that probably will hinder the kind of becomings, democratic becomings that all of us aspire to see across the Arab geography, not just in Tunisia. So really what we've got basically this inertia, and really partly this inertia is really a question of the what I've called in some of my writings the democratic learning, the good practices that we have not been able to pick up in places like Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, etc., etc. So I guess really I'll begin with this for now. Cheers.
Thank you, Larbi. Sam.
Very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here on this panel with friends, and congratulations on the publication of a wonderful book, which I've read, so I recommend it highly. I think with regard to the topic and what has been said, I agree with my colleague Al-Arabi with regard to this certainly not being the end. I mean, it's not simply the case that the Arab uprisings began in 2010 or 2011 and they failed. I don't think that is, that's the way to kind of look at history. I do think that, and I also agree with you, that the underlying causes, of course, of the uprisings in 2010, 2011, whether they had to do with youth unemployment or authoritarian politics or corruption or poor governance and so on, remain. They remain in all of these countries, and in fact, the situation in some countries is significantly worse than it was in 2011, 2010. The second point to make, I think, and this again comes as no startling conclusion to all of you, but it might be worth thinking about whether this is the case or not, whether you agree with it, is that if we look at the region overall, if we don't just look at North Africa, right? If we look at the region overall, I think there are good reasons for that. We see, of course, civil wars and state failure in Syria and Yemen, with multiple regional and international actors involved. We see a kind of unconscionable tragedy, an immense tragedy with regard to Syria. We see fragile states in Iraq. We see violent extremist groups. We see resurgent authoritarianism in Egypt and Bahrain, as well as in Turkey, deterioration of freedoms in Turkey, significant deteriorations of freedoms. We see the economic difficulties of hosting refugees, millions of refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. And we see, of course, even greater sectarianism and political polarization throughout the region. And so I would say that if you sum up that nice picture, and again, I'm only someone who knows something about the 20th and 21st century. I'm not a medieval historian. There's no question in my mind that this is the worst the region has been in at least 100 years or 150 years or maybe even more. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a potential for change and so on. No, of course there is. But I think, we need to come to terms with that. If there is something possibly new that, I could say more than what that obvious point is that, in fact, we've seen greater authoritarianism, deeper authoritarianism in Egypt, for example, compared with before 2011, whether it is regards to the extent of civilian involvement in politics or the increasing role of the security services, or detention, or unfair trials, or the clampdown on civil societies. By whatever measure, really, I think it's fair to say that we've seen the deepening and entrenchment of a new kind of authoritarianism in Egypt. Interestingly enough, also, and not just in Egypt, but throughout the region, we've seen something, and this gets to Al-Arabi's excellent point about difference, and that is we've seen incredible polarization politically and culturally, whether it is regards to religiosity, religion, sectarianism, and so on, an inability to come to terms with difference, really, right? And that's not something that is somehow essential to the region, but it has come to be, as it were, as a result of a number of factors and the inability to come up with institutions and political systems that can deal with difference. And again, that's not a cultural shortcoming. That has to do with political factors and constellations in power at particular times. Interestingly enough, precisely because, and this might be in tension with the idea that there is still possibility. Of course, there's always possibility for positive developments. But interestingly enough, precisely because of the chaos that we've seen, the regime breakdown, the fragile states, the increasing authoritarianism, the civil war, the violence, the chaos, the extremist groups, and so on, there is a newfound desire among many for stability or the status quo. And that, I think, is quite interesting, right? You see this reflected in public opinion polling, but you also see it as a regime discourse, you know. Well, things aren't great in Egypt, but look at Libya, or look at Syria, and so on. And that then has a consequence in terms of the perceptions of the public about political change and so on, which unfortunately I don't think is a positive development. I'll end maybe with a couple of things we've maybe learned kind of academically from the experience of the last few years. I think the first thing that we've learned is that, of course, although it is incredibly difficult to go against authoritarian regimes, forging democracy is just as difficult, right? In other words, how incredible it was for millions of Tunisians and Egyptians to do what they did, stand up to a police state in Tunisia, be in Tahrir for 18 days and have 1,000 die and so on against a dictator who had been in power for 29 and a half years. Now, as difficult as that was, forging democratic institutions has proven even more difficult, I think. I think the other thing that we've learned, or at least I've learned, is that we can no longer look at authoritarianism as something that is specific to a country. There is a significant regional dimension to authoritarianism in this part of the world, as there is in Central Asia. And what I mean by that is that democracy in Egypt or Tunisia or political breakthrough in Libya or what goes on in Syria is not simply determined by what is in the borders of Egypt and Syria and Tunisia. Regional players particularly, but international actors as well, have interests in outcomes. Sometimes this is called the counter-revolution and so on, but I think that recognition of the significance of the regional dimension to authoritarianism is very important. Maybe I'll stop there and see what the reaction is and what I hear from my dear friend.
Just start off first by saying how much of a pleasure it is to be with my esteemed colleagues. It's a very humbling experience, and actually it's also a very personal thing for me. It's part of my journey in scholarship that Dr. Samer was on my examination committee for my PhD, and then Dr. El Arabi was one of the commissioning editors for my book in his series. And then finally, Dr. Tariq is my current boss, so it's different stages right here and there on this panel. So it's a so it's a pleasure to be here.
But just to give yourself some more credit, we didn't know each other at the time,
yes.
So there was no corruption, no involved. Very unusual, yeah, for the region, yeah.
So yeah, it's a real pleasure to be. 6 years later, it's been incredible. I mean, this whole journey started for me at the personal level in Tahrir Square on 25th of January into 2011, where I was part of the, proud enough to be the part of the almost first wave of the protesters, and this is something I'll always carry with me that our generation has done. Yeah, regardless of current outcomes, it's something I'm very, when I say our generation, I don't want to make you guys feel old or anything, but our generation. 6 years later, of course, there's been lots of changes. It's almost like a couple of lifetimes have been built in those 6 years. But to echo Dr. Arabi's comment, a lot of the underlying conditions remain the same. So if we look at Egypt or Tunisia, Morocco as well, and Libya, if you look at Libya to a lesser extent, if you look at 2010, there was a perfect storm brewing of youth unemployment, higher urbanization rates, as well as a huge youth demographic. So we have these three interplaying factors happening, all with an undercurrent of authoritarianism. So fast forward to 2016, if anything, these conditions have actually worsened in terms of youth unemployment and growing demographics. So it seems to me as if the exact same conditions exist, and this provides for another recipe for potential destabilization down the line. Also, in terms of the polarization theme that Dr. Samer spoke about, this is very, very key. It's not only on the authoritarian governments, but once there's been an opening in the system, there's been incredible polarization between Islamists and the military, and it's almost like all of the youth who are actually the first wave of this uprising have been sidelined in Morocco, in Tunisia, for example. The Bouazizi who sparked the revolution was 23 or 24 years old, and the country now is ruled by Qadi Sibisi, who was 90 years old, you know? So action and reaction. In Egypt, we've had a return to authoritarianism that's even stronger than previously before. And as Dr. Samer pointed out, the argument is made is at least we're not Syria or Libya or Yemen. And this is like the weakest denominator argument that authoritarian regimes try and convince the people. But I think there's one of the main gains of the uprising. I think that the individual, average Egyptian, Tunisian, or Moroccan, or North African in general, it's a different person now. 2010 and 2011 specifically witnessed a breakdown in the barrier of fear. So if you could discount a lot of, or say that a lot of the economy has worsened, a lot of the issues have worsened, authoritarianism has came back, I think that the actual Arab youth or Arab individual now is a different game now. And people have definitely higher aspirations. So I would think that this is one of the main gains so far. But on the polarization issue, it's difficult. So once the youth led the uprisings, I remember in Tahrir Square, it was on the 18th day. On the 19th day, we went to Tahrir Square and we cleaned. And it was a very heartwarming moment. Here are the Shabab cleaning. They had a revolution and they cleaned up after them. And it was like a fairy tale story, you know, and the army was like, you guys have done a great job. Let us look after things here. And there was a slight opening in the political system. And of course, the political actor was most ready to step in were the Islamists. And initially, the Islamists made a deal with the military, and that deal went sour, and the military returned. So I guess one of the main lessons is for some of these youth powers is they were not able to translate street action or street protests into formal political structures that are able to be part of the political process and influence the political process. And the youth have been sidelined again in North Africa and in Egypt. Many of the activists who were at the forefront of the protest are now in jail or in exile. And finally, building on a theme that we spoke about earlier with Tariq, is there's a real undercurrent of pessimism by which the youth in all segments of society are keen to leave the country and migrate. So we have in disadvantaged socioeconomic segments, people getting on migration boats and risking their luck in Europe. At that segment, like I volunteered in a Syrian refugee camp in Greece. And I was there translating for some of the humanitarian agencies. And there's a line, and I was translating for Syrian refugees, and all of a sudden, I hear Egyptian Arabic, and then they're registering themselves as Syrian. So I had a chat with this Egyptian guy, and they were part of a group, and And he said, "Ya bey, أعمل إيه? What can I do? What can I really do?" I took my chances. I got on a boat. I actually flew to Turkey, and I got on a boat to Greece. I tore up my Egyptian ID, and I arrived saying that I am Syrian. So this is the lowest common denominator. In the higher segment, even in people who are more socioeconomically well off in Egyptian society, you have your engineers, Western educated professionals, and so on. A lot of these people also want to leave, to seek better opportunities overseas, or to return to where they were based, and so on. So you have, in almost in all segments of society, this urge to migrate. And this is unlikely to end. And I'll close on the message for European policymakers and US policymakers who are now, in a way, betting that authoritarianism will be able to put things back under the rug. I don't think this is going to happen, and it's quite revealing that one of the only meetings that Sisi had in the UN was meeting with Trump, and they were full of praise of each other as strong leaders and so on. But I believe that the bet on authoritarian regime in the long run will not pay off.
Thank you, Adil. I think the three of you have agreed on one thing, which is important for our discussion, which is that the underlying drivers for political change, for upheaval, for revolution remain in this part of the world. And that while we have not seen these transitions succeed, we have also not seen the end of the desire for change and possibly the propensity and the possibility for change to happen, however violent or peaceful that might be. But just to push you a little bit on what has happened in the last 6 years and to get some clarity on what went wrong. I'd like to
has a list.
I'd
I'll
like
make
to
a
hear
list.
from the three of you, hopefully in summary form, what you think ultimately undermined the transitions and created the impression that the Arab Spring has failed, an impression that is widely seen, widely felt, widely shared. What went wrong? Dr. Al-Arabi.
I think really for me, I've got always this preference for the longue durée, the long time span, to be able basically, to come up with confirmation of the kind of things you are pushing us to unearth, to unlock. For me, I think of the thesis of Rancière. Rancière is this French guy who has got this idea that violence is a motivator of social change, that it should be conceived of basically as any other dynamic in the political spectrum, the political sphere. And I really believe that, because really if you look at the history of great nations, the United States, Russia, France, what you find is that change basically was born in the bosom of conflict and violence. So for me, really, I beg to differ. True, there is like uncertainty and there is instability, but it is really part of the price that you have to pay if you want to engineer change, permanent change in the future. And I guess really that's really why we've got, it's true, I've said it's amorphous. The Arab Spring, tends to be amorphous. But you've got like this dynamic, which really, for me, is the thing that we need, to dig deep into, to be able to understand what I call al-hirak. This really beautiful word in Arabic, al-hirak. Like there's no precise English rendition for al-hirak. And I guess really the closest you come to giving a rendition to this term is peoplehood. And actually even the term shab, is noted for its absence in political parlance in the Arab world. And suddenly you've got al-hirak. Al-hirak is basically, so it denotes motion, denotes movement, and it denotes also bottom-up activism. And I think it's like morally grounded, and for me, there is something there, to be said about Al-Hirak, despite the fact that, this polarization that my dear friend Sami was talking about is actually, you can find it within Al-Hirak itself, because Al-Hirak is really bifurcated. It is at once positive in the sense that it is led and driven by the people who've got nothing to lose, like the downtrodden, in Frantz Fanon's parlance or language. But it is also, I guess, displaying itself in the sense that Al-Hirak can be also negative. It can be deployed by all kinds of forces that don't want stability. It can be, I guess, terrorism or terrorists, can be part of Al-Hirak. Sometimes you can actually find one force which can be both positive and negative in its kind, of utilization of Al-Hirak. So you've got a political party, for instance, which utilizes both terrorism, but it contests elections. And this really bifurcation, this polarization within some of the drivers of Al-Hirak is intriguing. It's really something that we ought, to understand. And I guess really without the benefit of the long time span, it's really very difficult to come up, to arrive at things or confirmations of what we are, trying, to question. So this is really on one side. On the other side, you've got like the emergence of new elites or new politics. This is really important. Like I think for, the post-colonial state has been generally either a pariah state or a failed state or a state that has produced a form of incomplete development, which is, of course, at the heart and at the core of the Arab Spring. You raise expectations, but then, you don't deliver the goods, and suddenly you've got, to deal with the kind of activism and youth, as explained ably by Adel. So really, these new elites, including, say, the Islamists in Tunisia or Egypt, they are new, but also they are really, and this is really the problem in Tunisia, that the so-called new politics and new elites are actually really people who had fought on university campuses, ideological battles with leftist forces. I mean, for me, when I guess when you fast forward from the 1980s, so you have like this interruption, this huge, I guess, interval between the arrival of Ben Ali in power in 1987 and then the revolution in 2011. So catapulted into the foray of Tunisian politics, the Islamists, and then really as if it's the resumption of the fights that happened, on university campuses. And that's really what polarization is. Polarization is the resumption of unfinished business between leftists and Islamists. But then really the Islamists, who come to the fore as, I guess, really the prophets of new dreams and new Tunisia and so on, turn out to be themselves actually champions of the status quo, because they were actually as keen on killing the revolution as the leftists, because really everyone wanted basically to reduce revolution to an electoral game. So really we go back to the kind of electoral democracy. And that is not really enough, because as I've said, if we go by a minimalist definition of democracy, it is the representation of difference. When you go to the south, the marginalized south in Tunisia, that is really, as we speak, you've got protests, in Kasserine, in Meknes, in Gafsa, basically the places where the riots first erupted in Tunisia. So really, it's really back to square one. And it's really also really about distribution. Ultimately, we talk about transitional justice. We talk about all of these, big عناوين قيمية, like these big values that we want, to deliver through this revolution. And none of them really have been basically delivered at all. So really, in Tunisia, like the gap between the regions, between, say, the north, the Sahel, the coast, and between the center and the south. So really, we live in Tunisia, which has got actually one of the most democratic constitutions. That's good. We give Tunisia basically full points for that. We give Tunisia full points for persevering with elections. We give Tunisia points for alternation of power. We had at least two types of regimes that have been in place. But the problem is that the distribution of goods is still unavailable to the south and to the center. And you've got people in Tunisia, especially in the phosphate basin, who've got a life expectancy of 50 years. Whereas people in the north and the south, can live up to 75, 76, etc. This is really a time bomb for the future leaders of Tunisia. So this is, I think, really part and parcel of this whole problematic that we call the Arab Spring in Tunisia.
Samer, and I hope you can reflect a bit more on the role of political Islam.
Sure.
In the setbacks.
Sure. I think I agree. I hope I agree with you because, you're always very profound. But I mean, clearly, I think that, what we saw in 2010 and 2011 and continuing until today, and of course this applies about politics generally, is struggles, right? Struggles and conflicts over power, over resources, over values also. And decision-making. And we've seen multiple actors, in all of these states, domestically, but also regionally and internationally. And unfortunately, to the winner go the spoils to a large extent. Now, I think we've seen that certainly in Egypt. We've seen that, I think, in Syria. With regard to Tunisia, and this general idea of, to some extent, implicit in what you were saying about whether the aspiration in 2010 and 2011 was electoral democracy or something, greater than that. Electoral democracy isn't great, but it's pretty good compared to what we're seeing in the region now. And with electoral democracy, and of course electoral democracy has all kinds of problems, don't get me wrong, incredible inequality, and we can see probably great differences in life expectancy and access to health care and education in the United States and Great Britain, and not just in Tunisia, and they're supposedly the height of liberal democracy. But to a large extent, some of the things that we see that are quite unacceptable in authoritarian regimes are not present in electoral democracy, with a kind of shallow definition of political participation and maybe no understanding or recognition for social justice and economic justice issues, whether it's torture, whether it's arbitrary exercise of power, whether it's unaccountability, whether it's the complete absence of the rule of law, and so on. So electoral democracy to me looks pretty good, and so on. Maybe if I were to say something and interpret your question with regard to Egypt in particular, and that is kind of what went wrong, right? And of course, I think one thing that we, at least I believe, is that the outcome today was not predetermined. I mean, these things are all contingent, incredibly contingent. And there are multiple actors and contextual and situational factors and so on. So it's not necessarily the case that because of what happened in 2000, we got to where we are today. Things could have been very, very different. Getting to Egypt again, what went wrong? The first thing that went wrong is Adil went home. He swept up Tahrir Square, and then he went home, I don't mean to, no. And that is, leaving it to the self-interested, right, old political players, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood or the military or, the phony political parties that we had and so on. So I think that's quite important. And this is another way of saying that the youth who made the uprisings were not able to create organizations and institutions and political parties and engage in formal politics, right? That's very, very important. The other thing is, militaries in our region are non-democratic institutions. We've got to, understand that, right? I mean, that's putting it mildly. And so to expect that they would have any interest in democratization or rule of law, they have complete contempt for civilians, at least in the places that I'm familiar with and whose passports I hold, and so on. The security, so the military in Egypt, non-democratic institution. The security forces in Egypt, as different from the military, actually manufactured insecurity. This was their blackmailing of the public. You want a revolution? You take it, but we're not going to police. And that production of insecurity, the manufacturing of insecurity, had tremendous consequences, right? People then yearned for rule of law and so on. My house was broken into. Literally, my mother, twice. My parents, my mother-in-law's car was stolen. And the perception of insecurity was even greater, right, than the reality. Islamists, I think particularly in Egypt, for all different kinds of reasons, were not mature enough or satisfied for limited political participation, right? They overplayed their hand. Now, I don't want to, like many people, put too much blame on them because these were situational, contextually specific factors, right, with regard to Egypt. And we could go month by month. The Brotherhood said, during the uprising, on February 6th, Issam al-Harian said, we're not going to run anybody for president, not even knowing that the outcome of the uprising was going to be February 11th. And for 12, 13, 14 months until March 2012, everyone, Mohammed Morsi, Khairat al-Shatir, Mohammed Badia, all of them said, we're not going to run a presidential candidate. We want to participate but not dominate. Now they changed their position, but for very contextually specific reasons. There's no way to understand it otherwise, but they made a mistake. And to some extent, the Tunisians learned a little bit the dangers of going for gold, as it were, right? Regional actors deserve a great deal of blame. And we're pretty close to a regional actor, I think it's south of here, that really has been spearheading anti-democratic politics. And I think, unfortunately, I'll say it, keeping the region backward with regards to all kinds of things, and not just democracy, gender, understanding of Islam, and it goes on and on and on. And so I think, that would be my headlines
very helpful
for understanding what went wrong in the Egyptian case, although I hate that sentence, what went wrong.
I know.
It reminds me of
Bernard Lewis.
Yes, exactly.
Bernard Lewis asked that question many, many years ago.
With his
Adil.
Well, what went wrong? We need a couple of hours, but we don't have time, so I'll just add to some of the themes that were spoken about. Again, the inability of these youth actors and people who took to the streets to formalize their admission to politics is a big problem, because electoral democracy sometimes is presented in the region as you put your voice in a box, okay, it's a bit of democracy, your dose of daily democracy, you walk out, and so it's also about respect for the rule of law and building institutions, and for even political adversaries to have civil relations with each other, and so on. This did not happen. There's this polarization of do or die. It's black and white. Unfortunately, is a major issue. And when there was a political opening, it was the Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood who were able, in the case of Egypt, to take advantage of this opening. And everybody shares a bit of the blame, but they also share a bit of the blame because initially they had said that they were interested in building coalition and building bridges with the youth. And as Sam said, that over the months and their position continued to evolve and change. I mean, there's a specific moment in history where Shafiq and Morsi were in the runoff to the election a few days before the final vote, and Morsi, then candidate, appeared on the stage with a lot of the youth actors and promised many things, inclusion of youth in his presidency, having a women vice president, having a Coptic vice president, and working on civil-military relations. There's a whole list of promises. But when they became part of the political power structure, it became apparent that they did not seek to challenge it. They just wanted a seat at the table, and I think this really was a big part of the regression. And I have a personal friend. His father is a big businessman in Egypt, and they used to go with Mubarak to an annual trip to China. Okay, so Mubarak on the plane will take a couple of the businessmen and they would go to China and sign deals and so on. So actually that trip happened when Morsi was in power, and Morsi went to China and took some of Mubarak's businessmen, but they made a space in the airplane for the Muslim Brotherhood businessmen to go on that trip as well. So it wasn't replacing, it was just we want a spot at the table. So this in terms of political actors. I think also what has happened in the region has had impact internally and strengthened the argument of yes, here's some authoritarianism, but we are the keepers of stability and so on. So other countries like Yemen and Syria, there were sectarian issues, there's sectarian fault lines in these societies, and these regimes were able to take advantage of these fault lines. Similarly in Libya, and Tara would know best, but these tribal and regional loyalties and schisms in society took hold. So the argument internally was provided to the regime of, hey, we are the harbingers of stability. Look at what's happening in the region, and so on. It's a compelling argument in terms of as the economy deteriorates and prices go high and so on. You want to at least have this modicum of stability. Again, to the point of Dr. Samer, the external actors, again, had a huge influence in stifling a lot of these movements, but if you put yourself in their shoes, there was no other option. Who are your reliable partners in political powers, either Islamists or regimes? There was no one else to do business with, so they chose a partner. Put simply, other players in the region chose another partner. Both arguably chose the wrong partners, but the most powerful partners.
Thank you, Adel. We want to get some of you involved with us in the discussion, so maybe a couple of questions, comments, interventions, or quick reflections from this side of the room? Or maybe we'll go to this side of the room while you guys make up your mind. Sir. Briefly, please, so that we can...
مساء الخير. أنا إسماعيل الله صحفي بجزيرة العرب. لمست أن هناك إجماع بين المتدخلين على تحميل الشباب مسؤولية ما الوضع الحالي. القول أن الشباب كانوا متحمسين، لكن بعد قيامهم بالثورات لم ينضجوا أو لم يتمكنوا من إقامة مؤسسات ديمقراطية. سؤالي، أين دور النخبة في هذه الحالة؟ الشباب خرجوا طواعية للشوارع، قاموا انتفضوا على الوضع، لكن النخبة يبدو أنها كانت تتفرج، كانت من وراء الشاشات، لكن في الميدان هذا الشباب الذي يتهمونه اليوم بعدم النضج لم يكن لديه تنشئة سياسية أصلا، لم يكن يشارك في الحكم. سؤالي الثاني، بخصوص موضوع الاستقرار لو سمى أو ما يسمى بين قوسين ببعبع الاستقرار. فعلا أنا مثلا أقدم من بلد الجزائر. هناك مثلا النظام في الجزائر وفي دول أخرى يستعمل بين قوسين بعبع الاستقرار. تريدون الاستقرار أم تريدون ليبيا وسوريا مثلا؟ لكن لماذا لا تسلمون أن هذه قناعة شعوب أيضا؟ الشعوب اليوم ترى هناك شريحة عريضة جدا، حتى النخب المثقفة تقول أن ما حصل.
So many people, they talked about the revolutions. They said that they were politicized, so they wanted to have change, but not in the way it happened. We're going to take another question, please. There was somebody who was raising his hand from this part of the hall. Shukran.
My question is about the role of external players, not only regional ones. And by this I mean the West, the United States, and the rest of it, and Russia, of course. I think what have been happening in the region is not kind of left for internal dynamics. And as we have seen in these cases, almost the final ultimate say was for external powers. If you think of, let's say, the relatively successful case, that is Tunisia, and the drastically failed case, Syria, I would say if the position of the West and the United States vis-a-vis the case of Tunisia was somehow negative and anti-revolution, saying to Ben Ali, just stand there firmly against the revolution, I think we would have ended in a different scenario. In Syria, we had the other case. That is because of the security of Israel, I think that was the crucial factor. Everybody this is the biggest elephant in the room. And because of nobody knows what would happen in the following day, so we had no support whatsoever for the peaceful revolution. So I think the external element and factor was so decisive in all the story of the Arab Spring.
Thank you. Two very good questions. I'm going to try to organize them and direct them to you. Dr. Al-Arbi, the first question to you, and I'm glad our dear friend brought up the role of the elites, the so-called educated, enlightened elites, who became, it seems, part of the problem and emerged as a casualty in the eyes of large swaths of the public.
I think in theory, what has evolved in Tunisia, Egypt, etc., is meant to deliver new elites. That has not happened at all. In fact, I insist that the key problem in all of these incomplete transitions and the trepidations of all of these transitions are the elites. And in Arabic, دائما أقول أنه نخبئ.
One says, especially when you speak about Tunisia, we have the worst kind of elites. The Tunisian elite is very bad, really bad.
What's happening in Tunisia, the return of Belhassan Tarabulsi, which is like, it's really an affront to any kind of moral claim, in a revolution that promised to deliver, or at least, to observe high standards of transitional justice, etc. And then you bring this guy who's like, really an icon of corruption. And then you've got basically, as Sami said, the polarization that you've got there in place. Also, like the entry for the first time in Tunisia of al-mal al-siyasi, like the funds, that are really poured into the country, sometimes, from undeclared sources, and also known sources, which, of course, like there's no free lunch. If someone gives you money, rest assured they want something, out of you. So this is really a huge, problem. I think really the youth,
We'll leave this question to
Cool.
them. Samer, on this question of the role of the external parties in not supporting, not protecting, and not extending the necessary resources and attention to some of these incomplete revolutions. I think the role of the US was cited, but many people would argue that, in fact, it was Europe that was particularly sitting on the sidelines, watching, and not extending the resources, the support in its own neighborhood and for its own interests.
I think that's to a large extent true. I think if we go back to the Tunisian case, if I'm not mistaken, the the French foreign minister or defense minister, right, was quite willing to support Ben Ali, and in fact had riot gear at Charles de Gaulle Airport ready to be sent, right? So, but speaking more specifically to Dr. Khalid's excellent question with regard to whether regional and international actors are the primary determinants of the outcomes we've seen, I would maybe beg to differ a little bit. And I have, as you recall, argued for the importance of understanding what's happened regionally and understanding the persistence of authoritarianism in the region regionally and not simply as Tunisia, Egypt, and so on. But despite that, if we look at Tunisia and Egypt, for example, I think it's difficult to argue that external players, whether they're regional or international, had the primary role in determining the outcome. It's certainly not the case in Egypt. The primary players, those who had agency, were domestic players, the Islamists, the military, whatever it might be, and so on. I think in Tunisia as well, certainly after the fact, after the uprising and so on, and during the uprising, I remember I was in Washington, D.C. at the time, teaching at our old university, Georgetown. And I was lucky enough to, if you want to call it that way, be invited to talk to the National Security Council multiple times during the uprising. And I remember leaving the meeting with National Security Council people, and there being ambassadors of certain shall we say, non-democratically inclined countries waiting to meet the National Security Council to probably say something very different than what I was saying during the uprisings. But I think if you, again, go back to Egypt and Tunisia, I don't think that the United States, regional actors, played a primary role during the 18 days of the uprising. There's no way that I think that anybody could argue that, right? It was, the Israelis were trying to keep Mubarak in place. The Saudis were trying to keep Mubarak in place. Hillary Clinton was trying to keep Mubarak in place, or Omar Suleiman, an orderly transition, and none of that materialized. And in Tunisia also, I don't think, after the fact, regional actors and regional factors play a role, whether it's Libya, Algeria, and so on, but I don't think determinative. In fact, you could argue that, at least in the Tunisian case, the further you are, the more peripheral you are in the regional system, maybe the further away you are from Saudi Arabia to some extent, the more likely it is you are to succeed possibly in overthrowing your authoritarian dictator and with the possibility of democratization. You could put forward that hypothesis for testing if you believe that. Maybe I'll stop there.
Adil, on that question,
Adil.
seems to be a pattern, at least in the last 100 years in the region, where youth lead revolutions and then they seem to withdraw from the public space, which helps ensure the incompleteness of these revolutions or the lack of achievements and consolidation of the kind of democratic transition that Al-Arabi was talking about. What did you find in your own research looking at Egypt in the last 70 years in this particular case?
Well, yeah, I discussed this at length in the book because my research started looking at the unions and the student movement in 2011. But as I dug deeper, I found this recurring theme throughout contemporary Egyptian history from 1919, 1946 in the era of the monarchy, where students and workers came together to, as part of the liberation movement, or a big part of the independence movement in Egypt against the British. There's always like a cause that got them together, but this collaboration was not sustained. And during the Nasser era, again, we see similar structures. It's, for example, in the Nasser era, the students and the youth were being co-opted into the regime through the Ittihad al-Ishtiraki to prepare a new cadre of youth that is part of the system. So the avenues for political participation were very, very narrow. If you look in a more democratic society, there's if you're interested in this area, you will participate in student politics. And that becomes an avenue to perhaps join a political party and build your career in politics. So the lack of formal avenues has always been an issue and continues to be an issue. And this also followed through into the Sadat era, where student politics were very initially active, but the state would be able to interfere very easily and jump in and annul student elections, as well as also for unions, that the union structure was incorporated as part of the state structure and was not allowed to flower outside of the official state structure, and on to the Mubarak era as well. So that is why authoritarian regimes are very keen to watch workers and youth personified by students. So this opening does not happen, and there's no formal avenues to join. There was some opening, but even after 2011, and student elections were reasonably free. But whenever the elections happened on campus, whether Cairo University or Alexandria University and Ain Shams and so on, that the state would come and annul the elections. Add to that, after 2011, to respond to the comment by excellent question, is that electoral democracy costs money. And in a country that has a lot of economic issues like Egypt, actually having money, political parties having money is a big component of it. They say ruz wal sukkar, you know, these boxes actually buy elections. In certain areas of Cairo and Upper Egypt, there are professional election riggers. Their career is to actually, and like the supply and demand impacts the cost of each vote. And it's become quite innovative in a way that they purchase the vote, let's say sometimes up to 400, 500 pounds in somewhere like Asr Nil, like a posh area of Cairo. But they send you with a camera to make sure that you voted for the right candidate and so on. So the funds available for established political actors were much larger than what youth can bring, because ultimately a student is incentivized to get a job, get married, and so on, and move on with their lives. It's a transition stage from student to adult. So they can direct a lot of their efforts to be part of the political process, but ultimately it's the bread and butter issues that are going to affect their participation in the political process.
Thank you. We will do one more round of questions, and I hope this side of the hall blesses us tonight. We will come to the gentleman. Yes. نعم. أنا عارفك زعلان مني من المرة الماضية.
I know you're not happy with me since last time. Thank God now I can compensate for last time. شكرا جزيلا. اسمي سعيد وأعمل كمدير لمجموعة استثمارية في الدوحة. صلحني رجاء، لكن كلمة عملية process لم تكن موجودة في اللغة العربية حتى بداية الثمانينيات، وكانت هناك كلمة استخدمت تسمى صيرورة، وأن بعض المؤرخين فسروا ذلك بالقول أنه لكي يعيش العرب في الصحراء وينتقلوا من مكان لآخر كان لهم يقين، وبالتالي الانتقال من أليف إلى باء كان يجب أن يعرف أن هناك ماء على الطريق وهناك خضار وإلا سيموت المسافرون، وأن مفهوم الانتقال من أليف إلى باء وفهم ما سيحصل في باء ثم إلى جي
and introduced in the 80s مع الفقه, and they put the word sayrura, which everybody started using in political terms. What I want to say is I look at the Arab Spring as a process, and I have a feeling that many people are starting to get to conclusions that saying the Arab Spring has failed. The Arab Spring, this is the result. I do not feel that. I feel that we are in a process, we are in a new stage, things are happening there, some new political forces are coming up, new identities are emerging, Islamists are retreating, etc., but there are new facts coming up that we need to understand and analyze for the future. What is happening is that the political stalemate that took us for 56 years is now cracking, and new things are coming up for our children, for our tech-savvy children who will be facing with new facts and building on it what they see is suitable for their lives to go. So I would love to see a discussion of the future of this process. What is next in this process of change that we are going through? Thank you.
That was going to be the set of closing remarks we're going to give them. But thank you for bringing this up. الأخ الفاضل اللي جنبك. الأخ في زميل جنبك على اليمين.
Thank you. I wanted to say something that fits in as a follow-up on what my predecessor said. See, revolutions do not occur in laboratories. They happen in the real world, and they're rather messy affairs, hard to be predictable. And having said that, I would like to invite comment from the panel on the following. Is there another phase in the revolutions? And this is what I mean. I will illustrate with 3 examples from history. The October Revolution started with the Mensheviks, and it was hijacked shortly after by the Bolsheviks. So there's definitely a pattern. And that revolution was happening on a background of a Judeo-Christian tradition. The next one could be looked at is the one in China, on the background of a Confucian tradition. Again, the Kuomintang started it, and the communists followed suit a couple of decades later. I am not by any means saying that they occurred in the same circumstances, but there is a distinct pattern. And one that occurs on an Islamic background is the one in Iran. Bani Sadr starts it, and the Ayatollah finishes it. Is there something like that that you can see happening, a pattern, a dynamic, which you can read into the events of the ongoing revolutions that are stemming out from the Arab Spring, which is a process? We agree. Thank you.
Final question.
Dr. Abdullah.
Dr. Abdullah رفع ايده. Dr. Abdullah has the right to speak anytime he wants.
Anytime.
Thank you. I don't have a question, but I have a comment, if I may. And I think, what went wrong is some of the points have been already raised. But I think it's the entrenched authoritarian state that we live in, that is the deep state, is one of the reasons that the revolution did not succeed. I think also the lack of civil society, or at least the lack of organized civil society, and lack of leadership, apart from the regime itself. There are no natural leaders. The regimes made sure in all the Arab countries they really destroyed any chance of another leader who could take over. Either you're part of the corrupted regime or you're out, completely out, and you have no say on it. And of course, the crony capitalism that they have built around them. Now, I believe that there is no Arab exceptionalism. I believe that this is also a process, and I think these revolutions are going to find a way someday. But at the same time, I think the process is going to be very long. Looking at what's going on and the experiences of where it went wrong, gives everybody a lesson. Do they really want to change? People are now fearful for their lives, for their families, for their livelihood. Do they want to go for another revolution? Despite what we say of wishful thinking, the polarization that are taking place, the regimes have played that very, very well. At the moment, they are getting us involved in conflicts between Islamists and non-Islamists. They're getting into conflict between Shia and Sunni, Arab and Persian, etc. And ethnic problems as well, ethnic conflicts. But I also think there is a lack of intellectual guidance for these young people, for the revolutions to happen. Our intellectuals have also been polarized in one way or the other. And basically, there is no sense of driving a clear message to the people. And I will end by also saying something about external power. Well, we know about the US democracy promotion. All the EU, European Union policies towards the Mediterranean and the free trade agreements was also based on promoting democracy. If you go now and you look at the US policies, they are not going to promote democracy. Definitely Trump administration is very much against it. They like authoritarian regimes, and they will work with Sisi and his ilk. And if you look at the European Union, they have completely changed their policies towards the region. Democracy does not come up in any of their new policies towards the region. They feel that they have really made a mistake in trying to interfere in the region. Now, having said this, there is a lack of external support. In fact, negative in a way. And also of all the internal dynamics that I've just explained, I think the process is going to be very long and very painful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abdullah. I think we'll come to our panelists to reflect on aspects of the questions or interventions you've heard, but also provide a set of closing remarks that are forward-looking about what we should expect and how you see things evolving. Each of you can take 3 minutes. We can finish within 10 minutes of now, and that will be very good to our very patient audience. Dr. Al-Arabi?
I think I'd like to finish by saying the processes we are trying to come to grips with basically are arduous. They are open-ended, and they are like complex. In Arabic, there's a better term, murakkab. It's multi-layered, really, and that is really important, to keep in mind. If you go back to the work of Samuel P. Huntington, when he talks about the third wave, or what's called in Arabic at-tamawuj, you will see that even within European history, that you've got basically processes of demotion of democracy, promotion and demotion of democracy. So basically, you've got breakdowns and you've got reverses. There is not a single process of democracy or reform, whatever you want to call it, that is irreversible, and that is really important. Even Egypt, I know sort of Egypt is in a spot of bother at the moment. But if you look at it, perhaps in comparison with Turkey like in 1993, 1997, had coups. But look at Turkey now, is really proceeding along a wavelength of sustained consolidation of modest democratic reforms. So really, there are historical lessons which, again, speak to the thesis that we should not hark back to Orientalist theses of Orientalism, that these are passive, they're exceptional, they're out of history, etc., etc. And really, ultimately, what I'd like to say is to invoke the work of Hannah Arendt when she talks about action. Action, in the sense of the moral commitment to restructure and reconstruct society, polity, economy, culture, etc., etc. And that is really from within, because really, personally, I'm not really too fond, of any kind of investigation that looks at the external dimension, because that is really a demotion of the local agency. Of course, that's not to say that the Arab region or Arab states are islands, living separate from the rest of the world. There are lessons to be had everywhere, and that is really important. So really, for me, it's a combination of Hannah Arendt, but also of Habermas when he talks about communicative action, and the birth of the art of argumentation, what we call in Arabic al-hujajiyya. So really, as Sen, the Nobel laureate, he talks about the argumentative Indian. And I think that is really ultimately what you've got today. You've got the argumentative Arab, the fearless Arab. that actually looks up, the dictatorial state, in the eye and wants basically to do something about it. That is really like the qualitative, change. If you are looking for change, that is a beginning. We're really at the beginning, of the road. Sort of. It's a long route, but we're getting there slowly but surely.
شكرا دكتور. سامر.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that I'm a little, maybe you'll disagree with me, a bit more materialist in my understanding of democracy. And, Habermas and the ideal speech situation and communication and so on is wonderful, but I would refer rather than to Habermas to Dankwart Rustow, right? And the passe. But the idea is that the idea is that democracy, to a large extent, is the second best solution, right? And what I mean by that, it is the agreement on basic rules of the game, so that there cannot be winner and vanquished. In other words, that you can live another day, right? You agree on the basic rules of the game so that even if you lose in the first iteration, you're not executed or banished, that you can potentially then play the game again. And this, to some extent, is actually a universalist understanding. What do I mean by that? I mean that I believe that Barack Obama, the only difference between Barack Obama and George Bush and Donald Trump and Zayn al-Abidin bin Ali and Hosni Mubarak is that one group of leaders are constrained by institutions and the other group of leaders are not constrained by institutions, and so on. And that if you put Dick Cheney and George Bush Jr. in the Egyptian situation, they'll have a field day. And if you put Mubarak in the situation of India today, or Brazil to some extent, not only to look at Western Europe, their ability for autocratic governance will be severely limited. And so this is what, and there's no intentionality to it. It just happens that, political actors realize that they can't get it all, and that they have to make an agreement about the basic rules. And even when they make an agreement, they still struggle to redefine those rules in their best interests. Interpretation of constitutions, the extent of executive authority, and so on, right? So it's always in process. I'll end by saying something to what Dr. Abdullah and the gentleman here about process and the revolutions. And that is that authoritarian regimes are inherently unstable. Now, that false stability can last a decade, it can last 30 years, and so on, but they are inherently unstable. And so what that means, again, is that this isn't the end, that there is tomorrow and the next day. And if they cannot resolve basic conflicts, right, and agree about how to distribute resources or how to deal with difference and so on, that is a motor of change and struggle and so on. And so that should be an optimistic note in a way. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Sam. Adil, you've got the final word.
Thank you. I think to the gentleman who raised the question, I agree that revolutions and process of change are historical and take time and take generations. So if we look at this current snapshot in time, things are dire, and there's a regression to authoritarianism and so on. But I like to look at the glass half full, and I mentioned that in the dedication of my book, where I dedicated to this generation, and then I wish the best of luck to the next generation. That this process of change is a process of ongoing change, and I think what we have witnessed in this period is a breakdown of this authoritarian bargain, which had ruled the region and other places of the world, of course, for a long time. We've seen it in our own lifetime breakdown. In Egypt, they are trying to recreate this authoritarian bargain, but we have a regime that is really bad at being authoritarian, actually, and keeping the bargain, by which, on one hand, you provide stability and economic security, and on the other hand, you rule the political sphere. This equation has broken down and continues to be broken down. And as I mentioned earlier, that the type of individual now on the street is a very different individual. Maybe the next coming period, the protests were not directed at the regime, but in unions or student unions, a little localized pieces of protest. Even today, there was a court ruling against giving the two islands to Saudi Arabia. So there are the little pockets of resistance, but what will drive the coming period, I think, are socio-economic issues. Are these regimes going to be able to put back together this authoritarian bargain or not? And I think they are, in the long term, keeping an eye out for the long game, they are destined to fail.
Thank you, Adel. This has been a very, very rich, enlightening, and very helpful discussion. I've learned a lot. I think the audience was equally interested. And as a result, we will organize another event on the Arab Spring, on the transformation, on the transitions. And we'll do so perhaps with a view to covering some of the issues that came up today, which seem to have raised more questions about aspects of these transitions. We might do this at the same event or in different other events. One theme that was important that I took note of was this notion of reconciling differences, dealing with differences. And so we could imagine possibly an event on conflict resolution and how you do that, especially in countries that are in the middle of civil wars. The Libyas, the Syrias, the Yemens. What is the record on this? What are the prospects? Another notion that kept on coming up was this notion of entrenched authoritarianism. The role of the military, the nature of the military as an institution. And I thought Dr. Abdullah captured it nicely by reminding us of the term that became
the deep state.
The deep state. So this notion of the deep state, which sort of we stumbled on it, or it stumbled on us in the last few years. We need to unpack this a bit more. What is the deep state? What do we mean by the deep state? And how do we characterize it? How do we unpack it? Those would be some of the ideas I think we can take to a future discussion. I want to thank our panelists for really being very open, very candid, very honest. And I would add from my personal side, in a world where it is easier and more convenient to not speak out, our panelists have been very courageous and open. We appreciate their openness, their directness, their forthcomingness. This is the spirit we want for the Arab world, and it's the spirit that we should expect of all of us. And so I hope you can join me in thanking them for being with us tonight, and thanking you for being